I'm Geoff Adair, and I am not a historian. In fact, I am a collector of probably folklore more than anything else. If there's somebody in the audience today that's from Davis Shore, for instance, and they know more than I do about what I'm talking about, I don't mind a bit if you all raise your hand, or don't raise your hand, just blurt out, wait a minute, that's not right, and contribute to the conversation. In fact, this is going to be interesting. I talk to the Beaufort Historical Association from time to time, and I always ask, how many people are from here, meaning born and raised here? And there is a sea of no hands. And so, but I'll bet right now, if I say, who's from Carteret County, meaning who was born and raised in Carteret County? Anybody here? Oh yeah, there's quite a few. Yeah. Well, I've been hearing some accents that are very familiar to me, and so that tells me that I am in a crowd of homies today, as opposed to with the Beaufort Historical Association. I've taken to asking them, instead of how many were born and raised in Carteret County, when I speak to them now, I say, how many came here this week? All right, the way I'm going to do this is, again, I'm quite serious. If you all want to contribute by telling me how to work my iPad, would be great. There we go. There we go. There we go. This thing goes to sleep real quickly, and so I have to restart it every now and then if I talk too long, so that sort of will remind me not to. This is about Palmer Davis, a man named Palmer Davis, and Davis Ridge. You can't really talk about Palmer Davis without talking about Davis Ridge, and so I'm going to talk about both of them, even though they're sort of only loosely related after the Civil War. Palmer Davis spent a lot of time down there when he was born and being a child, but after the Civil War, he did not go back. There were other people who did go back to establish a community there, and I'll talk about them. He came to Beaufort, and he became what was probably Beaufort's best known waterman. He was a skipper of a Sharpie, his own Sharpie that he had. He was the mailboat captain. He was a deep sea fisherman, and he seemed to be a man about town and was always there when you needed him the most, including some pretty harrowing moments during the hurricane of 1879. And I'll talk to you all about that. Palmer Davis is kind of, and this is another thing, this is the very first time that I have ever done any research on black people. And I have found and have come to appreciate their frustration in finding their own family stories, because you get to a certain place and the trail just is cut off. Sometime right after the Civil War it begins, but until you get to the Civil War or after the Civil War, the records are just non-existent. You go back 2 or 3 generations and you can't find anything but maybe, if you're lucky, a first name. And even, I'll show you an example of sometimes that's not even true. So it's about Palmer Davis. Palmer Davis was born probably on Davis Island, not Davis Ridge, but Davis Island, sometime around 1837 to 1840, something like that. And he was, like everybody else pretty much of color, he was born into slavery. I have no birth certificate for him. There were no birth certificates issued for slaves in those days. And what I do have is a snippet that I've taken from his death certificate that tells us a little bit about him. He was born, it says, in Davis, but that's not, they put Davis Island along with Davis proper, the community. In Carteret County, his father was some person that's lost to history named Peter. He probably was Peter Davis also, but he was a slave also in Carteret County, who was from Davis. We see down here that the birthplace of the mother was Davis also, and this is not when Palmer was born, understand. This is in 1923 when he died. nobody knew his mother. Everybody's got to have a mother. It's not like the fathers. My father used to say, a father's name is a matter of conjecture. A mother's name is a matter of fact. But this one, in this situation, Palmer apparently did not know what his mama's name was, or no one around him that was still alive knew what it was. But this, like I say, is from his 1923 death certificate. Oddly enough, my grandfather buried him, but we'll get to that in just a little while. He was born a slave to a man named Nathan Davis, and I don't have a picture of him, but we do know that Nathan Davis was a boat builder, and he was a farmer. He didn't have a plantation, but he was a farmer and a grower, and he was a fisherman. So he did all of those things while on Davis Island. And we know also that he had slaves. Now this is from the actual slave inventory or census, if you will, from 1850. The slaves that Nathan Davis, that's here, he inherited from his father, who I'm thinking was also Nathan Davis. And the way you can count this is the slaves are divided up by whether they're black, mulatto, male, female, their age, rough age, and it's hard to know exactly when that is. And then there's a number there, and nowhere is there a name. When I saw this the first time, I was almost heartbroken. Here's human beings that are accounted for simply by how productive they would be on a farm, basically. Their age or sex, that sort of thing, but not a name. So we count up the little slash marks on the number of slaves. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Apparently Nathan Davis in 1850 said that he had 5 slaves. I think maybe he may have had more than that. But this is what he listed for tax purposes, because again, they were taxable property. They were property. Now this is a very brief synopsis of the Davis family, talking about the people that we want to today. On the left is Palmer Davis, and he had several brothers. We know that 2 of them were Sutton Davis and Proctor Davis, and I think that there was another one named Thomas and Adrian, but I found Thomas yesterday and did not change this. But there may have been even more than that, and of course there probably were some sisters too. So, but we do know for a fact, and I'll tell you how, that Sutton, Proctor, and Palmer were all brothers. They were all born about the same time, between 1835 and 1845, and they were all born on Davis Island. And we know, actually, I'll go ahead and get ahead of myself, that lady right there was the last person to have been born on Davis Ridge. And she told an interviewer in 1988, just before she died, that Proctor was her uncle, Sutton was her grandfather, Proctor was her great uncle, Sutton was her grandfather, and Palmer was a great uncle. So we know that they were brothers and all born on Davis Ridge. The other thing is, you can look at this and see basically the genesis and population of Beaufort's menhaden industry. And I'll show you how we get to that. Those 4 guys up at the top were the patriarchs, if you will, of what later became Beaufort's menhaden industry, which was dominated by black Davises. They were actually the captains and the engineers of the boats, not just the crew, but they were the crew also, the descendants of these guys. So the Beaufort's menhaden industry really did come from this little tiny family tree. Now, if you were to put all of the Davises that have descended from the inhabitants of Davis Ridge, that would fill a graph. Henry Gates couldn't do it. There'd be so many of them. It was a ton of them. Like, for instance, Sutton had 16 children, which is pretty amazing. But anyhow. Now, let's talk a little bit about Davis Ridge. Those of you who are from Davis, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the best way I've been able to parse it out. To begin with, Davis Island is really, and this is from a current map, fairly current anyhow. Davis Island is an island that is unto its own down at the very end of the peninsula that's formed by Core Sound on one side and Jarrett's Bay on the other side. And so that's Davis Island. And that's probably where all these guys, these slaves, were born, because Davis Ridge was not populated at that time. That's where Nathan lived. That's where he had his farm. That's where he had his boat building business too. Now Davis Ridge is a place of high marsh and land right along the edge of Jarrett's Bay, on the east side of Jarrett's Bay. And I mean, what it really is it's just, I think Karen has said that there's a community up on Chesapeake Bay and they call it 3 high places in the marsh. Am I right? That's right, exactly. Well, that's kind of what Davis Ridge was, is a high place, because back of Davis Ridge, this is all marsh, and all the way up to where you get some high area that's now Davis, the community. And so Davis Ridge was just a high place in a marsh, basically, that had some acreage. And Davis, the community, sometimes called Davis Shore, and I have seen some writers say, this portion here is Davis Shore, and this up here is Davis. Now this is, I'll yield to the home folks, but I don't think that's right. I think that Davis Shore was Davis Shore first, and then in the late 1890s or early part of the century, when the federal government gave Davis community a post office, rather than calling the post office Davis Shore, they called it Davis. And so the community's official name on the postal register is Davis, but old timers still call, I mean, my father always called it Davis Shore. We had accounts down there and we'd go to Davis Shore to deliver oil. And so that's the reason why I put it in parentheses. I don't think that Davis Shore was different than Davis. I think they're the same. Now, this is an 1889 map of Davis Shore and Davis Island. And the thing that should jump out at you is, first of all, Davis Island's a lot larger. It was big enough in those days to support a farm and a boat building place. The other thing is that it's pretty much connected to the peninsula that is where Davis Ridge is located, so that you could walk from Davis Ridge to Davis Island and back. In fact, if you had good enough legs, you walk on up to Davis too. I mean, you go through the marsh, but along the shoreline there. So all of it was connected. Now, oddly enough, there is a little slough that goes through right on this map. And I have read that that slough was cut in the hurricane of 1899. And before that time, there was even no slough there. It was connected. So we go back in time even further. 1866, we can see maybe a difference, but there's no slough, or a very small one, if you could. Kind of like Barden's Inlet, you know, didn't really exist. And then 1837, which was the year that Palmer Davis was supposedly born, 1837, it's connected. So, and the island is bigger, and it's hard to tell because they didn't put the whole peninsula in there, but this 1837 map as far back as I could go. Now this is Davis Ridge. I've circled it in 2 different aerial photographs. One is the current photograph, and the one to the right, the 1939. I found aerial photographs from 1939, and you can see that I pieced them together. And it's kind of blurry though, isn't it, folks? See if I can do a better job. There. Well, that's not great, is it? There we go. Now, it's kind of hard to tell with a black and white photograph, but you can see that's a substantial island relative to this. So, a friend of mine and I were talking the other day, and she said, well, if we don't really need to go too far to see the evidence of rising sea levels, don't necessarily have to agree on what's causing it, but we certainly don't have any problem knowing it's there. Right? So, you can look at something like this and tell. And there's Davis Island with Davis Ridge in the background today. The slaves that became former slaves that established the community of Davis Ridge spent more time in Williston, from best I can tell, that they did in Davis proper. They would go directly across Jarrett's Bay and go to school events, and that's another thing that's really interesting I have found. I'll go ahead and just put the elephant out there. There isn't many black people down east nowadays. There was before the Civil War, but they were slaves. After the Civil War, the black population declined sharply and quickly down east. But the people who settled Davis's Ridge, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but the people who settled it worked harmoniously and lived harmoniously with the people down east right on until the hurricane of 1933, which was what ran them off. It wasn't racism or violence or anything else that ran those people off. They happily worked side by side on mullet crews with white people and shad fishing and everything else. It was a storm that ran them off. So that's kind of one of the surprising things I found about this. The Civil War started, and in '61, April of '61, and about a year later, Burnside's expedition came down the Sounds to Newbern, captured Newbern, came across Bogue Sound, captured Fort Macon, occupied Beaufort, and that was pretty much the end of the Civil War for Carteret County in 1862. That's the capitulation of Fort Macon, and my great-great-grandfather is somewhere. I keep looking for him, but he's actually in that crowd of people who surrendered. And then Beaufort was occupied. How many people have seen this photograph before? Did you all know that is a Union officer sitting on horseback in front of the Lee Craft House? I didn't know that for a long time, and I kept looking. I said, well, doggone if he doesn't look like he's wearing bars on his shoulders. And sure enough, he is when I got a download of the photograph rather than like the 30th copy of it. And so Beaufort was occupied. And when that happened, and this is a fascinating part of history that I'll bet you don't know. When that happened, the word went far and wide in eastern North Carolina that the Yankees had come to free the slaves. And so the slaves began leaving where they had been born and raised and had worked for a master, and they would just pick up and leave and go to what were known as contraband camps. Now, this is complicated, and it's really surprising too. It was dangerous for them to do that, even though the Union Army occupied everything in eastern North Carolina. Here's why. The Union Army and Abraham Lincoln were trying to convince everybody in the world, primarily Europe, that the South had not seceded, that they might be trying to secede, but not everybody in the South wanted to secede, and the South was actually still part of the United States of America. But the United States of America had a law called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act let anybody capture a person that they thought was a slave and return that slave to its owner for a bounty, usually. So even after the Union Army got here in 1862 and occupied this region, even after that happened, if the slaves left in broad daylight and walked around, there was an excellent chance somebody would scoop them up and take them back to their owner to collect a bounty if there was one. Even right here with the Union Army right at our doorstep. So they had to sneak away. And that's what the slaves on Davis Island did. Sutton Davis, we've met him earlier in the talk, Palmer's brother, took a band of slaves, and we don't know how many, in a rowboat at midnight across Jarrett's Bay, landed near what is today Smyrna, and then walked from that point up to New Bern, where the Union lines were at that time. And they escaped from slavery doing that. Had they been caught, they could have been returned back to Nathan Davis, who was their owner, and who was maybe offered a reward or maybe didn't. We don't know. But the bottom line is they escaped and made it all the way to New Bern. They became what was known then as contraband. The reason why they were called contraband is the Union officers knew, Union soldiers knew, that the Fugitive Slave Act existed, and they knew what it implied about the capture of fugitive slaves. And so they devised a theory that if you captured a slave that was owned by a Confederate, not a soldier, but just a Confederate citizen, then you were capturing contraband of war, and you could seize it and keep it. So what the Union officers would do is they would capture, quote unquote, seize slaves and call them contraband, and that became the name of former slaves who had escaped. They were contraband. If you read any first-person accounts of the Union officers and soldiers writing letters to each other, they will actually call a person that was a slave formerly, they'll call them contraband. And they call the contraband camps too. This is aggravating. There's probably a way to keep it from happening. This is, if you think that this is far from us, it isn't. These, and you probably can't read them, but if you go up, I'll show them to you later. If you read these are notifications in the area's newspapers that were in the 50s, 1850s, and 1860s offering rewards for fugitive slaves. I went back into the archives, found the old newspapers, found the advertisements, and there they are. And there's hundreds of them. These are just 3 that I found. 1 for Onslow County and 2 for Craven County. Carteret County had them too, but we don't have the newspapers on the archive. Our newspapers don't go back that far. But the ones in Craven County and Onslow County do. So they're actually offering bounty for slaves that have tried to run free. The last one is actually a New Bern one. They caught some guy, some mulatto guy, in New Bern and just scooped him up because they thought he looked like he might have been a slave. And he said he was a freed man from Baltimore, but they basically advertised for somebody to come get him if he was kind of like, well, I'm not going there. I mean, you see how disgusting it is. Okay. There was contraband camp at James City. That was the largest one in North Carolina, eastern North Carolina anyhow. There was one here in Beaufort called Uniontown. How many people know about Uniontown? Okay, some people do. All right, good. Uniontown was where many of the runaway slaves went and were guided back to a camp that was north of Cedar Street and east of Turner Street. And that's how the black community in Beaufort was established. It was actually what they called a contraband camp for fugitive slaves. And it just stayed. Did y'all know, by the way, that Beaufort's population in 1865 was predominantly black? Yeah. It actually was, Beaufort had a higher population of black people than it did white. Okay, that is a picture, an actual photograph of a slave in James City. That's how he showed up looking. They did a picture of him, a photograph, which was really kind of odd because photography was really in its infancy, but that is a slave taken in James City. He's not a slave from eastern North Carolina. He had come down from Raleigh somehow and had escaped getting captured and was in James City.
Geoffrey?
Yes?
So these contraband camps, where were the slaves essentially just gathered there but could move about freely, or were they prisoners again with the Union soldiers?
I don't think that they were prisoners. I think that they could move about, but they knew to expose themselves to, if they got on their horse or something and went to some other community, they were in danger of being captured because, yeah, I mean, I think they stayed voluntarily. Now, I think Beaufort was relatively safe, and they didn't have to stay within the confines of the camp itself. They worked and did whatever they wanted to in the local area. I mean, you had the Union Army here. But to take off on their own and go to New Bern, let's say, to visit a relative, I just don't think that happened. Yeah, that's what I think.
Geoffrey, I do know that the Union Town in Beaufort, they had their own street of commerce, their own stores. Did that start then, or did it come later?
No, it started immediately. Those folks were industrious, and they took their freedom very seriously, folks. And so, yeah, they built their own houses. I mean, it wasn't like the Army built houses for them or anything. I mean, they built their own houses. And in fact, this is in James City, this house here, but you can't really tell much about it. But you can see that house and see what they built just to have shelter. So, yeah, but they had stores and everything. In fact, the Washburn School started during the Civil War in Beaufort. That was a school for black children. So, I mean, they were very industrious, and they took their freedom seriously and went about their lives. Yeah, absolutely. Then the Civil War ended, and when that happened, and this is absolutely amazing, Sutton and Proctor Davis, who had been apparently in a camp in New Bern, James City, left the camp, and in 1865 returned back to Davis Island and got up with their old master Nathan and said, "Nathan, we'd like to live here again, and we'd like for you to sell us some property over there on that ridge over there that was called Sally's Lump." Am I right?
Yeah.
Sally's Lump was what now is Davis Ridge. So they went over there, and 3 acres was marked off. And ladies and gentlemen, this to me is one of the most amazing things that I have seen in my research, even though it's going to look rather mundane to you, I'm sure. That is a deed where Nathan Davis sold Sutton Davis 3 acres of land on what is now Davis Ridge. Hold on a second, July of 1865. The war wasn't over then yet in some areas of the United States. Robert E. Lee had surrendered the Eastern Campaign in April, but the war wasn't over yet in the Western Campaign. And even at that point, Nathan Davis and Sutton Davis shook hands. Nathan Davis recognized that Sutton was a man and could own property, and sold him part of his family property over on Davis Ridge. That, to me, is a remarkable thing. I mean, even before the dang war was over, Nathan Davis had, and there's another avenue, there's something else to that. There's every reason to believe that Nathan was not only Sutton's boss and owner, Nathan was probably Sutton's father too. Because of all the brothers, and I don't have a picture of him, but Nanny, the lady that lived until our generation, said that her grandfather was a very light-skinned man. So I went yesterday and looked at his death certificate. There's no birth certificate, but I looked at his death certificate. And on on Sutton's death certificate, he doesn't list Nathan, but he doesn't list anybody. The person says, whoever wrote it out says, don't know who the father was. Did put the mama's name, believe it or not. So anyhow, so that is an actual deed.
So how much did he pay for it?
Well, that's an interesting question. He paid $10 and other love and other consideration. But if you've ever done any title work in your life, you know that all that is you're hiding what the person actually paid for it. Soselsky, when he looked at that, he said, "Oh gosh, that's a price for relatives." But that's not exactly, I mean, all deeds pretty much in those days and even today will quote the price as $10 or $1, love and other consideration. And what you're doing there, of course you can count the stamps if you know what the stamps were worth in those days, but that's just what, he's not going to put on the deed how much he actually paid for it. Now Sutton, by the way, was a very good boat builder, and so I'm thinking that maybe he might have had some trade going on. I don't know, but who knows? But that deed is in the Register of Deeds office if y'all want to go look at it in Carteret County over in Beaufort. And what did they do on Davis Ridge? This is the first thing they started doing. That is the Atlantic Menhaden, and this is in 1865. And C.P. Day didn't show up here to be a Menhaden person until the 1880s. C.P. Day actually came as a Union soldier, but he didn't get the Menhaden industry going until the 1880s. Sutton Davis and Proctor Davis and some of Sutton's 16 children started the Menhaden industry in Carteret County. And the way they did that was they caught Menhaden using smaller schooners inside. Nobody went outside in those days. And they caught them and dried them and pressed them for the oil. Rendering plants had been going on for a long time for hogs and beef and such as that, mainly hogs. And they basically applied the same as best I can tell, applied the same technology to Menhaden to get the Menhaden oil and then dried the remnants in order to make fertilizer. But that was happening in 1865 on Davis Ridge before it ever happened in Beaufort. Here are some boats that are Menhaden boats, and you probably wouldn't recognize those because they really are Sharpies is what they are. They're probably, at the most 30 feet long. And but they would catch the Menhaden in those days in the sounds, and they would do it pretty much the way we catch mullet today. Not Menhaden, but mullet today. You would encircle the fish, a school of fish, and then instead of dragging them up and pumping them into a boat, you drag them up on shore and bail them into a boat. But even with that, the catches were obviously tiny. Now, Sutton Davis built some boats, two of them. One was named the Shamrock, and I can't remember the other one's name, but they were basically Sharpies or skipjacks looking very, very similar to this. In fact, this photograph...
Mary Reeve, I believe, was the name of the other boat.
Pardon?
Mary Reeve.
That's right, yep.
Yeah.
I like this one because it shows the way the boats are rigged. And you can see that it's a working style rigging there. That's both of the boats have come together to tie the net off, and they'll drag it ashore. But this camera was probably mounted on the shoreline. Yes, Sue?
What do you think that top flag is?
I saw somebody make a guess of that one time. It's kind of hard to know in black and white. I have no earthly idea.
That's the Davis Shore flag.
That might be, yeah.
It looks like a horse track.
Yeah, it might be. Now these photographs are from the Brimley collection, and his collection goes back into the middle 1800s. Well, maybe a little bit further, maybe a little bit, 1880s at least. So there's no reason to think that this wouldn't be a core sound boat. Maybe not from Davis Ridge, but somewhere. And that, believe it or not, is the first generation of Menhaden plant. Again, the technology for rendering animals, the oil from them is old. So apparently what they did was just apply that technology of boiling until you get the oil out and skimming it off and then drying the remnants for fertilizer or animal feed or whatever else. So that's one of the first. This one I think was probably the first one in Beaufort. I don't have a photograph of the one that Sutton Davis actually built himself. But the other thing that they did was mullets, and I asked somebody if they recognize. If you recognize what that is, you're from Carteret County. I don't care where you were born, but yeah. And they would in the mullet season, these guys from Davis Ridge would sign on with mullet crews that would fish all up and down the coast, and they were absolutely as integrated as anything you can imagine. White and black men working together, living together. They would build what's called rush huts or rush camps. That's one behind you right there. First time I saw this drawing or sketch or whatever, charcoal, whatever it is, I thought to myself, that must be from somewhere else. Nobody here builds those things. But in the old days, they would go over on the banks and build them some shelter to live in, stay over there for weeks, catch the mullet, dry the mullet roe, and these crews would work until the mullet had gone. And then after I had congratulated myself on knowing this was from somewhere else, I found a real photograph of Shackford Banks with a mullet crew, and that's a rush hut with a reel and a boat and everything else there. So sure enough, that's exactly what they did. But these crews came from, Harlow, from Davis's Ridge, from Beaufort, from down east. They were white, black men mixed together, and they just all worked on these crews that's how they made a living. That is a 1910 photograph of catching mullet. You can see the line, the cork line goes all the way down the beach, a lot further than that scene right there. Ms. Mason, do you say you think does that shoreline look familiar to you over there?
That looks like old Oyster House, I know.
Yeah, could be. That's Beaufort, according to Brimley. I don't know if it really is or not. I'd hate to drag my my net across those oysters there.
That looks like that down on Front Street.
Yeah, yeah.
Down past the falls.
And that's 90,000 pounds of mullet caught in one day. And now you understand that refrigerators hadn't been invented. I tried to calculate how many pounds of mullet, if you had 90,000 pounds of mullet, given Beaufort's population in 1910 or whenever that was taken, how many mullet a person would have to eat in Beaufort every day to get.
It's a lot of money.
That's a lot, but they actually they dried them and shipped them. So So anyhow, but that's a lot of mullet, yeah. And oystering. Now that's actually Beaufort there too. But the men at Davis Ridge also did a lot of oystering, and they would peddle it over in the mainland at Williston and Smyrna and places like that. So that was a side industry.
My grandfather had the first oyster house down east.
Where they would open them and can them.
Down at the foot of the bridge. It wasn't a bridge there then.
Oh yeah, I'd be doggone.
That goes on down.
When, if you don't mind me asking, when was that?
Oh, I don't know.
It was her grandmother.
Yeah.
So I would think they're,
Oh, my grandfather built it.
Yeah.
He was raised in
I
the
would think the early 1900s.
Yeah. Now, do y'all? There was an oyster packing plant at the west end of Ann Street in Beaufort, and it actually went by several different names. The same plant. It was Enterprise. It was Duncan. I can't remember the third one, but it was the same plant that different owners would own. Oystering was a big industry here around the turn of the century, last century.
big thing.
Yep.
And their cans, they ordered each week, and they would come in big old, and we would play in them, make playhouses out of them. The boxes that the cans came in, they were gallon cans, and you had to stamp your number on them.
That's how you got paid, wasn't it? Yep. I've been doggone.
I remember it.
Okay. And they did some hunting too,
Yeah.
along the shoreline. And everything else, and this is one of the things that Nanny Davis Ward made a point of, is that on Davis Ridge, they did everything that they need to do to sustain them. They grew their crops, they grew sweet potatoes, they grew collards. She said sweet potatoes as big as your head. That was her quote. But they grew their sweet potatoes, their collards, their corn. They did sweet corn for themselves and fodder corn for the animals they kept. They kept animals on Davis Ridge. They made their own clothing unless they went to town, either to Beaufort or Smyrna or Williston somewhere, and got a bolt of cloth. But otherwise, they would spin their own cloth for clothing. Obviously did their own washing, everything. About the only thing that they would do is they would barter for things like sugar and coffee, and they would do that across Jarrett's Bay at one of the communities. But otherwise, and they didn't use money. Nanny Davis Ward said that she didn't know what it was like to pay a bill until after she left Davis's Ridge. I keep calling it Davis's Ridge, but it's Davis Ridge. because they didn't have money over there, and they didn't. I mean, it was just a way of life that was almost like a commune, a little bit. Now, back to our friend Palmer. Palmer didn't go back to Davis Ridge after the war. He showed up in Beaufort in he may have come before 1866, but he was here, I know for a fact, in 1866. And rather than stay inshore and fish sharpies for mullet or fish sharpies for menhaden or oyster or anything like that, Palmer Davis had a different idea. So he came to Beaufort, and this is a contract that Mary Watershaw found for me, and I can't remember where I'd have to, anyhow, she found it for me. And I've circled his name there, and that is a crew of a brigantine that was going to leave from Beaufort in May of 1866 and go to Norfolk. So this is the first reference I have to Palmer after the Civil War, and that was in 66. So in May, presumably shortly after this contract was let, Palmer got on a crew and left Beaufort. I don't know if that was for the first time he left this area or what, but he left the area and went to Norfolk on this brigantine. And as you can see, a brigantine is big enough, probably not transatlantic, maybe, but it's a coastal trading boat. At least it would have been in those days. So he got on that and left the area. Now, what you see here is in October of that same year, we see Palmer showing up on a hospital record. And it was the hospital, the Union Army still occupied Beaufort in 1866. That was the Union Army hospital, and Palmer shows up there. And his diagnosis isn't, well, the symptoms that he's showing is something called remit, R-E-M-I-T, fever. And I've asked Jackie, who knows something about medicine, what that is, and she says, well, we don't use that term anymore, but I think that what the dictionary tells me, or what Google tells me, is that it's a fever that oscillates up and down, but never gets low enough to be called normal. And it can be from all kinds of pathogens. So not just one particular cause. And you have to wonder what kind of thing did Palmer run into on that brigantine going to Norfolk. It could also be scurvy or rickets. I think I'm right. A dietary problem. So it could be almost anything. But he shows up there at the hospital and he's down for the count from October until December. So, well, in those days, there's no antibiotics. They basically hold your hand and tell you to do the best you can. So, not a lot to do for it. That's a blow up of that, say, Palmer Davis, and R-E-M-T, fever. So, but he lived. We've lost track of Palmer Davis after this voyage and after the hospital stay. But he shows up, and this was 1866, he shows up in just a minute in 1879. And I'll show you, he makes a grand entrance, and I'll show you how. What you're looking at there is a graphical depiction of the Atlantic Hotel that I found in a Charlotte newspaper from the late 1850s. It was before photographs were printable in newspapers. If you wanted to put an artist, something in a newspaper, well, everybody's seen Frank Leslie newspapers and all the Harper's Weekly and all those. You didn't have photographs; you had lithographs, or what I'm trying to say. Well, that's what this is. It's a lithograph, and that's the front view of the Atlantic Hotel. Now, tell me, where is the Atlantic Hotel? Where was that? Who can tell me? Sue, where?
Well, there were two.
Ah.
And this one was in Beaufort, and it got wiped out in the hurricane. And there was no Bird Shoals. I mean, there was no protection of the downtown area. And they rebuilt it over here in Moorhead, and everyone hated Moorhead.
Bingo.
That one burned in fairly recently, like 1940.
Yes, I remember.
1933.
And that was Hart Pine, the whole thing.
Yep.
The first one was where the Braden Ballpark is today.
Right.
That is correct. Yep. So this is the Atlantic Hotel in Beaufort. It has a strange background too. Josiah Pender built it. He was from Tarboro originally. He was a firebrand secessionist. He built this in the 1850s, but when rumblings of war started, he decided that he was going to be a Confederate and formed a militia. The Topsail Rifles was the name of his militia. And he let the hotel be managed by somebody else, but he became major, colonel, general, I don't know. He was some big wig in the Confederate militia, not the Confederate Army. Because later on, when they really did want him to be a Confederate in the Confederate Army, he didn't listen to orders very well and got kicked out. But the bottom line is he was the owner of the first Atlantic Hotel. And it was really quite an attraction for eastern United States. People came from all over, hence the advertisement in the Charlotte newspaper. A man by the name of James J. Adair was one of the people that he conned into joining the militia. It was my great-great-grandfather. And he stayed in the Army and was ultimately captured at Fort Macon, and that ended his military career. All right. This is an actual photograph of the Atlantic Hotel taken from the side. So you're looking towards the west. And that's the east side of the hotel and the building behind it. Now, all of you who have ever lived on the water probably cringe at the sight of this. A wooden hotel, 3 stories high, on pilings, before creosote, out in the water. What could go wrong? Okay.
Kinda like the beach, don't they?
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's the way it was. It actually was not on the water, as most people say. It was in the water. And
What year was that?
this photograph was taken, well, I know it was before 1879, but I can't tell you when.
Now, is it true that there were some Catholic nuns during the Civil War and
Ca-
they took care of people?
That is absolutely true.
And it was like a little hospital?
It was a hospital first, because he got this. The guy who owned it was a Confederate, and so when the Union came, out he went, and the Union Army took it over as a hospital, and it was so poorly run that somebody finally got the Catholic nuns to come, and they whipped everybody's butt into shape, and it was much better run after that. But that is absolutely true. So this is the Atlantic Hotel, sometimes before 1879. And just so that you can get my friend back here in the back, you can see a current picture. I tried to stand as close as where the old photographer was when I took that. So that's a then and now. And you can see that there's a lot more land on Beaufort that's been pumped up than what there was back in those days. And a seawall. There wasn't a seawall in those days. And that's a barometer falling. What happens when a barometer spikes low like that? Hurricane. Bad things when you see a barometer doing that. That's right. So in August 22nd of 1879, the barometer in Beaufort started doing that. And it just so happened that was the weekend that Governor Jarvis, North Carolina's governor, Jarvis, and his entourage was staying at the Atlantic Hotel in Beaufort. They had come all the way down on the train to Morehead City and had gotten into a boat, maybe piloted by Palmer Davis, don't know, and had come over to Beaufort, and they were staying in the hotel, along with a lot of other guests. Yep, if Jim Cancore had been alive, he'd have been here. Ain't no question about it. But there are reports that some of the old timers here in Beaufort started seeing frigate birds. Everybody know what that is? That's a tropical bird that rides on hurricane winds many times. And they started showing up in Beaufort, and they knew something was up. But there wasn't any real weather forecasting in those days, and so everybody was fine, went to bed the night of the storm. Storm sort of came, didn't know it was, should we evacuate, should we not? No, I'm going to ride it out. I hadn't left this building, and I'm going to ride it out. So everybody stayed. At 5 a.m., the anemometer blades at the Cape Lookout Coast Guard station blew away. It was already over 128 miles per hour at 5 a.m. And then it got worse. The storm destroyed every single wind gauge in any official capacity along the coast from Hatteras to Wilmington. We do not know how hard the wind blew, and that it blew hard. It was a blow. We do know that Beaufort was absolutely devastated, to the point now it's known nationally as the Great Beaufort Hurricane of 1879, because it landed right square. My father used to kid my mother all the time. She'd say, Glenn, where's the hurricane going to go? He said, it's going to land between Harold Simpson's dock and the Alfonso, but we don't know where. But that hurricane did just that. It came right ashore in Beaufort. There's what it did. It was a strong Category 3, but that's because nobody knows how fast the wind actually blew. It might have been a 4. Probably was. It had absolutely devastated Beaufort. There's Governor Jarvis. He's happy in bed at 5 o'clock in the morning when the wind starts blowing the building away. Literally, the building is shaking, roof's coming off, pieces of it are flying. People are trying to get everybody out of the hotel, but the hotel, you may recall, is actually out in the water, so you have to walk down the walkway, not the walkway, but the boardwalk, to get to land. Waves like Atlantic Beach are crashing on the shoreline right there at Front Street. There's debris everywhere. One man, Conkleton, who's I think kin to me, I'm not sure, he has already died trying to save some people. He got washed overboard and washed out and drowned. Governor Jarvis is finally awakened. He's rushed out onto the boardwalk and runs up onto the mainland, which is between Craven Street and Queen Street. And the town is devastated. But there was a hero. And that's not him. No. The hero was Palmer Davis. Somehow, at that time of the day, Palmer Davis came and rescued the governor and a family named Sloan, their children. He literally waded down the shoreline and climbed up into the debris and picked up a child in each arm and carried him to shore. Palmer Davis. That's a good point there. Governor Jarvis saw this happen and declared Palmer Davis to be the hero of the day, and it was in newspapers everywhere. So that was the first time that anybody knew who Palmer Davis was, other than just, I guess, his relatives and friends. But he actually waded back and forth, saving people and leading them through the debris and through the storm to get to safety rather than perish in the storm. Pretty amazing, actually. And that's where, by the way, that's where I met Palmer Davis, because I was reading the account of that storm and of that hotel and ran into his name, and probably a month later I was going through Brimley's photographic archives and saw a picture of Palmer Davis. And I swear to God, folks, if I could have reached out and shook his hand, I would have. It was absolutely astounding to me. After the storm, though, Palmer Davis still remained in Beaufort, and he got a job with the mail boat. The mail boat was a Sharpie that ran between Davis Hotel, which is down at the very tip of Front Street, the West End, across through the Sound. Did y'all know that, and you locals know, but did y'all know that there was no causeway in those days? It was marsh all the way from the end, from what we call Duncan's Green, down at the end of Turner Street. Pivers Island was there, but everything all the way up to the Haystacks and beyond was marsh all the way to what's known as Shepherd's Point over in Morehead City. Shepherd's Point was as far as they could run the railroad, and that was it. They stopped, but it was all marsh. So there was no way to get the mail to Beaufort except by boat, and Palmer Davis and his friend A fellow by the name of Steve somebody, Turner. Steve Turner ran the Sharpie once a day, leaving at 3 a.m. from the Davis dock, not Davis Shore, but the Davis Hotel dock, across the marsh to Shepherd's Point to wait for the train to come. Train would come, throw a bag of mail to them. Any passengers that needed to come would get into the Sharpie, and they would come back and hopefully get back during the daylight. They did that for 18 years and never missed a trip. Never missed a trip. That was a long way, too. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see on the left side of my map there, Morehead City and the train going all the way out to Shepherd's Point and then stopping right at the banks of the Newport River proper. And then you can see over here on the right side, Beaufort and Pivers Island still there. And then you see that mesh of marsh in between. And they made that trip every day for 18 years and back, which wouldn't be too bad when the wind was blowing and the tide was calm. But when the tide was rolling in the wrong direction and the wind was calm, he had to pole the whole way. Like a friend of mine said, I don't mind poling 5 miles if I don't have to carry the damn pole. Lord. And that was Palmer Davis's Sharpie right there at the end of the Davis dock. You can see right out towards Fort Macon there, right there. That scene almost is unchanged, almost. But you can see the way that she was rigged and everything.
What was the year of this? Where are we in the years?
I don't really know exactly when that is, but I would guess, looking at the photograph, I would say somewhere in the 1870s, 1880s, something like that. Probably the 1880s. Jameson Ipock gave me that photograph to use. That's from her family archives. Yeah. And that's our friend Palmer Davis. That was the first photograph I saw of him in the Brimley Historical Archives. We see that in the background. That's the Sharpie. And you see that in the way background. That was the old fisheries lab at Pivers Island that's long gone now. That was built in 1903, the same year that the Wright brothers flew their airplane. 1903, that's the old fisheries lab. And he's standing on the dock in front of the Davis Hotel. Tall, lanky man. Yep. This is a little bit later in his career, but that's Steve Turner on my left. And that's the Davis Hotel in the background. Y'all remember Miss Jo House? Yeah, Jo House, that's her house right there over Palmer Davis's left shoulder. That's the corner of Moore Street and Front Street. And you can see Palmer Davis. It's kind of funny. If you look closely at Palmer Davis's shirt in this photograph and Palmer Davis's shirt in that photograph, you can see that even though it's years later, or it looks like it's years later, it's the same shirt. Come on. Thank you. See? That's right, exactly. But then the train came. They built the train trestle all the way over to Beaufort through the marsh. Took about a year or so to do it. They didn't really pump up too much land, but they just put it on a wooden trestle. And so you can see that the train's here. This is a pretty rare photograph taken from the lab, from the old fisheries lab. They have 2 towers, and this is in one of them, looking out over the marsh at the train going back to Beaufort. I'm sorry, going back to Morehead from Beaufort. That's a pretty rare photograph. I found that one in the Duke, I almost hate to say that word, the Duke Archives. Well, I'm pretty confident that it was a Yankee who was, I'm sorry. Never mind. Yep. And there's a train, that's actually the first train in 1906. November the 18th, 1906, the train backing into Beaufort because they couldn't turn around. That's God's honest truth. They would turn around in Morehead City and back the train across that long 2-mile trestle all the way into Beaufort so they could come ahead on her when they were leaving. Yep. Okay. So Palmer Davis is no longer the mail person because Palmer is now put out of a job, and he has hung around the Davis Hotel so long and is so much loved there that Miss Davis hires him to be the butler. And that's how he spent the last part of his career, enjoying himself being the butler at the Davis Hotel. I have blown that picture up and blown it up, and I think that may be him standing there on the front steps, but I'm not positive. He's got a dog with him, and but that's the Davis Hotel today, and Davis Hotel sometime in the late 1800s. He became the butler, but he also had a side gig. He would take tours out on his Sharpie to fish and to just go out and sail or whatever else they wanted to do. And he was well known for that and carried, it was kind of like those days version of the charter boat captain. And he was well loved by that. That's the dock that he was standing on a minute ago. And again, that's Miss House's house over there. And all three of the reason that's interesting is the Davis house hasn't been joined together yet. That happened under one roof later on. And he was a property owner. Palmer Davis bought some property at lot 164 in Beaufort. He was married, had children earlier than this, but became actually landed. He actually bought the property up north of that too and started collecting real estate, and was well known in Beaufort, both among the white community and the black community, as being sort of the grand old men of the town. This is an advertisement. I go into old newspapers and find stuff. This is a real advertisement for another Sharpie named the Rosebell. And you can see that not only did they carry passengers between the railroad and Beaufort, but they also did day or night, winter or summer, convey passengers, or any point in the harbor. So they'll go anywhere you want to. So this is similar to what the gig Palmer Davis, but not the same guy. His name was Lewis Washington. He also, have you ever seen the picture in Beaufort of a guy with a mule behind a cart on Front Street? Same guy, okay? Lewis Washington. Here's a guy that has written an article in the newspaper, and he says, oh, by the way, if you want to go fishing, call for Palmer Davis. He's a clever darky, and he's a good Democrat. He's the last one here, I guess. And the Hampton is a good boat. The Wade Hampton. Now, Palmer Davis would not name his dang Sharpie to Wade Hampton. Who was Wade Hampton? Who can tell me?
South Carolina politician.
He was a general in the Confederate Army before that, cavalry general. And he became, yes, in the South Carolina, so it would be difficult for me to believe that Palmer Davis would name his, and I think I'm right because I found a boat registered to a Palmer Davis about the same time on the Coast Guard registry, and it's actually called the C.P. Wade. I think what happened is the guy who wrote this just didn't think too straight and confused C.P. Wade with Wade Hampton. But so I think the word Wade was in the name of the boat, but not Wade Hampton. Now here is a group that's doing exactly what I said. They're with one of the black guys that ran the boats. I don't know if that's Palmer Davis in the back or Washington or any. There was about 5 or 6 of them that made a living doing that. One of the interesting things about this is a group called the Sunshine Club, which came down and chartered the boat to go out. In the summertime, you can tell from the white clothing and everything. And they're all going along there. But if you look close, there ain't but one person smiling, and that's a young lady sitting on the port gunwale with her hat on. She's facing you, got her hands in her lap. Everybody else looks like they're getting ready to sing Buicks. And they might have been from Raleigh, especially this little tyke in the floorboard there. He's sat right down. But this is, I do know the date of this, 1906. So. During one of those trips, Palmer Davis took a group from Goldsboro out, a family, and they went to the bird show. Now, Sue is right, the bird show in those days was a show. And it was a good place to stop and put your boat up and go swimming. A lot of people did that. But there was plenty of holes and channels in it, around it. And this group from Goldsboro, a man and his wife and 3 children, one of them a toddler, went out and started swimming. And it wasn't long before the toddler jumped into water, or ran into water that was well over his head. And so one by one, the rest of the family jumped in the water to try to save him, and it was over their heads too. And nobody knew how to swim. Palmer Davis, with the help of one other guy who happened by, rescued every one of them. Even though one of them was, the father was in bad shape and had to be hospitalized, he saved everybody's life. That was the second time Palmer Davis hit the news circuit in North Carolina for saving a white family. It was in all over, you can see Asheville, Morning Post, Goldsboro paper, everything. What's heartbreaking is the way they titled everything. One man, Negro saves, Negro hero. You know, rather like it's some amazing thing that Palmer Davis would try to save somebody that was white. I mean, that doesn't, anyhow. So that's the second time that Palmer Davis was a national, or at least a state hero. This is Palmer Davis's death certificate. He died in January of 1923. My grandfather is, you can see Adair and Rice at the bottom of it, we buried him. He actually was a member of this church that's still there, and that's where the funeral was. And there was no way on earth to get everybody in that building. It was January, it was cold day, raining a little bit. I know because I looked up the national weather thing for that day. It was cold and raining, and the crowd went out and just covered the street. I mean, there was thousands of people who came from all over. And part of it was probably because they had met him while he was the butler at the hotel. But the other part, I wonder if it was people that he met while he was a deep water sailor. Bottom line is, literally, according to the newspaper, it was the funeral was in the Beaufort News newspaper. It was so well attended. Anyhow, so there was tons of people who came. He was definitely well loved in Beaufort. Then, this was 1923. 10 years later, a hurricane hit Beaufort, and it was another terrible hurricane. This one probably was worse than the one back in the 70s, 1870s. It sunk boats, tore down radio towers, destroyed beach condominiums. They didn't have those, beach houses. And it devastated Davis Ridge. The story is that all of the families that were still living on Davis Ridge in the 33 storm had to hold hands like a giant snake and snake their way up through the marsh to Davis Shore in order to be saved. And then after that, nobody went back. So the town was completely wiped clean, although this 1939 photograph either shows structures, a few structures that maybe survived, or where they were, at least, maybe foundations, can't tell. But that's 1939, and you can see there's still a little bit left there.
My granddaddy said that the water went to his 5th stair step
Yeah,
in the house.
it was a bad storm. Beaufort's front street was devastated. I mean, everything was. It was. What happened is the storm went right up Core Sound, right up Core Sound, and it pushed a tidal wave of water up the Sound, hemmed in by the banks on one side and the mainland on the other side, pushed that right up the Sound and flooded everybody. Now you've met her, that's Nanny Davis Ward. She's the one who lived until 1990, I think. And in '88, she gave an interview to some folklorists, and that interview is in the Maritime Museum in Beaufort. And she talked all about life there when she was a child. And that's how we know most of what we talk about now with Davis's Ridge, because otherwise there's no real good records of it. But the menhaden industry, I've already talked about that, was born on Davis Ridge, and the captains and the crewmen of the menhaden industry in Beaufort are all basically descended from, at least the black ones are, descended from Davis Ridge people. Including the captain of that boat. Who knows what that one is? Mr. Parkins. The Parkins sunk in 1942. It's a long story, but she sunk. Her captain was David Davis. and he was a direct descendant of Proctor. And that's Davis Ridge now. Up at the top is Proc's Point. You know who he's named after. Proc's Point is named after Proctor Davis. So that's where he lived. Except in his day, they called it Quinine Point because malaria was still so bad in those days. And I guess he named it or somebody. But he said that's Quinine Point for all the mosquitoes that was up there.